Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You are listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Most of you probably want to start a business by the time you approach midlife, but sometimes answer the question, what business would that be? And especially, where would you actually locate it? Why not do what one American did? There's a story here that we have in front of us that we're going to share with you today. The book is called Le Deal. It's how a young American in business and in love and in over his head kick-started a multi-billion-dollar industry in Europe. And as most people who may have never started a business before, sometimes we think, start with start A, get to plan B, go to plan C, and find yourself off to riches. But many of us who have actually done business realize it isn't that linear, much less, many more linear than it would be in Europe. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest who experienced this particular industry in Europe, Mr. Byrne Murphy. And I'd like to welcome to the program our guest, Byrne Murphy. Byrne, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Funny story here. There certainly was a culture shock when it came to putting an American business in Europe. Tell us about that.
Well, first off, I was a refugee of the S&L banking crisis in the early 90s, in an era not unlike the era we are currently in. And anytime you have that much disruption in the economy, there are, in fact, opportunities, some of them great opportunities. But I had this idea, and I jetted off to Paris very, very suddenly. In fact, I went over for a 10-day reconnaissance trip, and on the 8th day I called my wife. We just moved into a new house and said, honey, don't unpack any more boxes. And she said, you're coming home to help. And I said, well, not exactly. And that's how fast we did it. We never unpacked the boxes, and I never lived in that house. I don't advocate moving quite that fast, but if you do have a good idea and you undertake some serious due diligence, in fact, this is not a bad time to launch a new company with a new idea, as long as there is a niche out there. You have to research that niche.
Now, one thing you need to understand when you're launching a company, especially in another country, is although it's an American idea, you've got American ingenuity and know-how, you really can't always apply American principles. And this was something you discovered when you were starting to jumpstart MacArthur Glen, which was a retail outlet in France, that there's a lot more to getting it started than location, location, location. Tell us about that.
Well, there is very much. In my particular case, I had no idea that bringing over an off-price concept, these are what in America we call designer outlet centers or factory outlet centers, I had no idea how much that would touch a social nerve in Europe. The old world of Europe relishes, as it should, its city centers and relishes the existing jobs, and there is no emphasis on new jobs and new ideas, but only on preserving jobs with the existing ideas. So as I landed there, not just 6 months after Euro Disney had opened, to a terrible hue and cry about what a disaster it was and how the Americans had done it only their way and not listened to the Europeans, I came along 6 months later with a similar concept and therefore was lumped into the same category, Disney, Disney, Disney. And in my case, it wasn't location, location, location were the three keys, but politics, politics, politics on all sorts of levels. And I was so deeply in over my head, I didn't realize how much was stacked against me for quite some time.
Now, you describe in the book that the first thing to start off with is what is known as, and I hope I pronounced this word correctly, an interlocutor.
Interlocuteur.
Okay,
yes.
There you go. I sometimes get twisted up with French, but go ahead. So tell us what this person is.
Well, I obviously was a foreigner. I had spent some time in France before, but never in business, and certainly not in the conditions in which I found myself. An interlocuteur is somebody who says, here, I'm going to take you by the hand, and I'm going to not only introduce you to the key people and the key forces that are going to be affecting your efforts, in this case to open a new business, but I'm also going to guide you culturally and advise you and whisper in your ear when no one else is looking to help you understand that you not only have to listen, but you have to hear. And frankly, Americans aren't so terribly strong at listening and hearing beyond our borders. Today, only 28% of Americans hold a passport. When I went over there some 17 or 18 years ago, it was less than 10% at the time. So it's not something we do so well, and it's because we don't have to. We have a fabulous economy and country right here, surrounded by oceans. But should you decide you want to go overseas, you must listen. And one of the ways to help you listen is to have an interlocuteur helping the introductions around the country and around the culture.
Now, Byrne, you also, along with this coach, if you will, or guide, have to learn to dance. So, as you learned in France, you have to learn to minuet. Tell us about that.
I think most Americans know the expression of minuet, which is based on the Victorian era French dance, where the music comes and goes, and you bow and you pirouette and you dance in circles. It's a bit of an intricate dance where everyone has to be in lockstep together. And le minuet in France, in my context, was knowing that, for example, it was knowing how to deal with the politics. There, a mayor who was elected locally could also be a congressman nationally and could also be a governor regionally and wear all three of those hats all at the same time, something you can't do in America. And so when you would go in to seek the required government approvals to build, for example, a building, as I needed to, I had no idea initially that there was a whole dance that needed to be undertaken. Just the lunches. You conduct business in France over a lunch with a politician, but you never discuss the business at hand until your coffee has arrived between the coffee and the dessert, as they say, entre le poire et le fromage. And then you only have about 10 minutes. You better be ready, and you better know how the dance works, or that dance partner just rejects you, and you have to go on to the next town.
Also learning how to enjoy fine wines throughout the day if you're not a day drinker.
The wines went on and on, the champagne. Anytime that I had to go to small towns, that's the type of concept they had, and the mayors are very proud of their region and their produce, and so they would always start with the champagne from their region, and then the white wine from their region, and then the red wine from their region, and you had this 10-minute window in which you needed to unveil all the great goodies that you were going to bring to their town. And I found in the first 6 months I'd already had so much wine and cognac that I dealt horribly with my 10-minute window, and it was clear to me I needed to first build up my alcohol consumption capability before I could even get to the politics.
And the next step is, as you realize that you got your minuet shoes nice and broken in, is that you have to be willing to put up with a lot of meetings.
The meetings, the role of the government in much of the old world in Europe is a much stronger, much more infused institution than here in America, even with the expanded role of the government over the last few years. And as a consequence, you have to deal according to a government timetable and a government mentality on one hand, and that is many, many, many meetings. And on the other hand, government or not, we have to remember that these towns often go back millennia in terms of their origins, whereas in America we go back a couple of hundred years. So we are used to fast, move, create, and they are much more comfortable with reflect about it. We haven't done that before. And in France in particular, every French person is brought up in grade school studying philosophy, Cartesian philosophy. And Descartes taught that one must reflect and study a problem from every angle. But Descartes never described how to solve the problem. So many French people are brought up learning how to reflect and study and view a problem and not have any sense of urgency in the American style to solving it. And that was very, very frustrating for me.
Now, also with American ingenuity, we're very big in America about promoting good teamwork, which really isn't any difference, I'm sure, than in another culture such as France. But the difference, too, is that there, if you build a team, it's a team of rugged individualists really looking out for the individual instead of the team themselves. Tell us about that.
Well, I thought I was, I guess I'd say that it took me a year or two or maybe more to realize my single biggest challenge wasn't securing approvals from a government. It wasn't learning how to market in a foreign culture and a foreign language. It was to take this group of disparate people whom I'd hired and transform it into an effective working team. And my vision of a team was that we were all members of a boat, and we were in crew rowing together, going down the same lane at the same time to the same cadence. That's what I aspired to. I realized belatedly that they had no concept of that. More, their sense of the team was that there were 4 or 5 or 6, 7 lanes, and each one was a runner, and all they had to do was run straight in their lane, and they presumed if they were in charge of the sales, they didn't have to bother with knowing what marketing was doing or what finance was doing or construction. That was their lane. And so I realized I was the only one in the boat, and the boat wasn't going anywhere because they had all gone off on their races and no one looking over their shoulders. And that was a big adjustment. And that kind of cultural, psychological difference varies country to country, even north of Germany, which is very has a different heritage than the south of Germany. That took a lot of nuance and a lot of time, and that's the single biggest challenge, again, for Americans who just assume, you study a problem, you analyze it, you come up with a solution, you implement it, you measure results, you make changes, and you move on. That's not necessarily how it's done in other cultures, and we have to be aware of that.
What do you think would be one of the single biggest pieces of advice you can give to an American entrepreneur starting out that you learned from your experience of building a business such as you did in Europe?
Well, I would say, first off, context matters a lot. Culture matters a lot. Business is not just P&Ls and balance sheets and marketing plans. And this would apply not only if you have a concept and you go to a foreign country, but if you're, for example, from New England and you're going to open it up in New Mexico or Florida. Those are regionally different areas with regionally biased viewpoints on life. And if you don't listen and hear, you are not going to understand the context, and you're not going to understand the cultural differences. You could end up beating your head against the wall. In a foreign land, foreign culture, it just means that there are going to be a lot of surprises coming your way, almost all of them unpleasant and therefore costly. If it's in your host culture, but you're in another region of America, it's pretty much the same. The consequences may not be quite so negatively dramatic, but time is money, and if it takes you a long time before you realize, I better listen as well as do, as well as try to execute, then you're starting out behind the 8 ball. That would be my number one advice.
Now, you talk about execution, and there was a moment in the book, Le Deal, where you talked about wanting to be a little overly executionative, if you will, and that is when you were being handed a jest. So learning how to accept a proper jest is also an important aspect of business in France that I understand.
It is. We're very, very action-oriented as Americans, and certainly we on the East Coast are, perhaps to a fault. Okay, what are we going to do today? Let's multitask. Let's get it done. Everybody line up. Raise your hand. Let's go charge. And if you need buy-in, I come back. I really do believe in taking a group and transforming it into a team. And if you're going to do that, then, as I say, you not only need to listen, but part of the listening is sometimes inaction is as important as more rapid action. And it may appear as though it's inaction. In fact, it's an investment into the relationship. And in France, I must have heard 10 million times, faut avoir un bon contact, what they call the bon contact, a good contact between you, the foreigner, and them, whatever French person you were then meeting. And if you haven't invested in that bon contact, if you rush that lunch with the mayor, and you just insist on talking business right away, you will not have a bon contact. You will not get your approval because he's not going to trust you because you've never invested in the relationship. So where are you going to be when he really needs something from you down the road? Gone. That's important.
Now, Byrne, you've certainly touched on this, but let's go ahead and go over it for our listeners again with a couple of extra touches. Now, you did work with a lot of people from across different cultures launching MacArthurGlen in Europe. Talk about the keys of what it takes to build a successful international team.
Well, the first is that you have to lead from the front. And that means that every time you go and set up another team, whether it's in Germany or in Italy or Sweden, and I opened up in almost every country. You have to lead from the front. You have to be willing to take more bumps and bruises and setbacks than you ever want them to have to take. And they have to see that. They have to realize you believe so strongly in this concept that you are being, it's almost like a boxing match, and you're going to take the first 3 rounds, and they only have to step in for the second half of the 4th round. When they see you taking those lumps, then they go, man, this must really be important. He believes in it. And that's very important, leading from the front, leading by example. And then, as I say, sitting down with them, listening and hearing to their counsel about how maybe to do it better the next time. I always stick to the principles of the concept that's being imported into the foreign language, the foreign culture, but the nuances of how to import it and execute it, that comes by listening to the locals. And in order for them to be open to telling you the truth about how it really needs to be done, they need to believe in you, and they do so by seeing you lead from the front.
Now, just to let our listeners know about this experience, you began to launch this business, MacArthur Glen, the retail outlets, behind someone who had had a jump start by at least several months. And they're still there and they're successful today. So you have very good competition. Do you find that that was actually a very important element to why you were successful?
Well, yes. Like many Americans and like many athletes who like to compete, once you realize that, in this case, somebody with whom you were speaking about the concept actually jumped ahead and did it without telling you or started doing it, then, of course, you get your competitive juices running. And so you start sprinting to catch up and hopes to pass them. Now, it was in the sprinting where I made most of my mistakes because I was trying to go too fast in foreign cultures. But having said that, to have initially one very, very strong and credible competitor out there kept you so focused on the passage of time, on getting markers in the ground and being the first to get the big brand landed. That actually was very good, and it served him well, and it served us well. And then when other competitors in different countries showed up, we were such a finely tuned machine that though we did need to know more about that country, we were off and running. So for 7 years, this person with whom we had spoken initially and was a friend of mine from college and beyond, for 7 years, he and I never even spoke. That's how competitive it became. Years later, 13 years after we started, was the first time we traded notes about what happened at the very beginning, and we both agreed that though there were some unpleasant moments in there from a business perspective, it actually served both of us quite well. As he said, competition is good.
Absolutely. The book is the deal. Our guest today, Byrne Murphy. Now, over the years now that you've established MacArthur Glen, how have you been embraced by the European culture now that you've gotten over, at least call it the initial bumps and it's been launched?
Well, I guess the biggest surprise to me is that it was clear 2 and 3 years, 4 years after we opened the earliest centers and we were opening others in other countries, it was clear we had a big success on our hands. And the concept of value-priced shopping didn't exist over there for high-end brands. What really surprised me is that success we had in the early years was nothing compared to 5 and 8 years after that. In other words, the concept became better and better known and became more and more popular. And one of the things about which I'm most proud and we worked most diligently on was determining where to place these centers and how to coordinate the efforts of these off-price outlet centers with the downtown retailers. And in fact, in the regions in which we operated, the downtown retailers, their sales would go up and not go down because of our presence, because we would ensure we had stock of last year's that they didn't have. We would give brand exposure that they weren't doing. And ultimately, the success was great for both of us, but the success in terms of volume was much greater than we'd ever projected. There's the old expression, pioneers get eaten and settlers get fed. Well, we were the pioneers, and it was bumps and bruises and tough times for several years. but eventually we settled down, and it turned out to be very good for us, for the established brands, and for the shoppers.
And I'm sure, Byrne, that you discovered that it just wasn't linear like you at first thought it might be.
Oh, those business... I wrote a business plan in 10 days after my first 10-day reconnaissance trip that I mentioned. And everything was linear in the plan, and there is nothing linear about being an entrepreneur in Europe. I have gone on now and launched 2 other concepts brought over from America and Europe, and it's the same. It's circular, it's curvilinear, it's 3 steps forward and 6 back, and that's part of the process. It's also the charm of the old world. But if you can introduce that new concept, you will have created your own barriers to entry for the new people trying to follow in your wake, because it is that difficult. So there are rewards, but I would say the rewards are much, much more than just commercial. If you're intellectually curious, if you like to travel and are open to experiencing new cultures and worlds, it is infinitely interesting. It's every day is another exploration. It may be another headache, but it's also another discovery, and I very, very strongly recommend it.
The book is Le Deal, How a Young American in Business, in Love and in Over His Head kickstarted a multi-billion-dollar industry in Europe. And our guest who did that is Mr. Byrne Murphy. Byrne, if you could, for the listeners, give out a website they can find out more.
LeDeal.net will give more insight into the experience and the background of what happened over there over those years. The book itself is available on Amazon.com and most major bookstores. And ultimately, I come back, it's not just a story about business. It's a story about exploration and discovery. It's a story about maybe there are different ways to respond to the down economic times in which we find ourselves. There are niches out there, and there is plenty of what's called private equity, investment money, for a good idea and a lot of hard work. As I said earlier, context matters. Culture matters a lot. And if you can listen and hear, then there are all sorts of possibilities, almost endless. And I strongly recommend looking at foreign cultures to help implant new ideas.
Mr. Byrne Murphy, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you, Dan, for having me.
Okay, hold on.
Take care.